Thank you for that. I apologise for that. Can people hear me? Could a couple of people just type in the chat box if I'm coming across, you can hear me. I apologise. For some reason we had some technical issues there with the sound. So if people could just indicate that that's in fact the case. Yes, okay, I'm getting feedback. Thank you, I'm getting feedback now. So I apologise for that. Hopefully you can hear me. And I guess I just quickly reiterate, there are 6 modules. Welcome. Not everyone in this webinar is at lunch. We've got people all over the world, but welcome wherever you are. Feedback is a really critically important issue, and we find that survey after survey demonstrates very clearly that people are not getting enough feedback, and that becomes critically important. So what this survey here is showing you, or what the data in front of you is showing you, is that if we give positive feedback, we will engage employees. So there is a correlation between positive feedback and engagement. Interestingly enough, if we give critical, or what we might call negative feedback, there is still a degree of engagement, as you can see with the blue line. So what that's basically saying is no feedback will not engage people. So if you give no feedback whatsoever, whether it's positive or negative, you are likely to be disengaging people, which is a real problem, obviously. So what's the moral? The moral is give feedback, whether it's positive or negative, but try to balance it between positive and negative. So that's the key message out of that. So I want you now to go out of this broadcast and actually practice this. So this afternoon, if you happen to be in Australia or wherever, the next day, wherever you are, I want you to actually go out and start practicing giving feedback. I want you to give feedback in the hallway. I want you to give feedback in the corridor. I want you to give feedback in the employee's work area, wherever it might be. Okay, I've heard that things are we're still having issues with the audio, so let me see what I can do. Okay, I'm hoping that that's coming across and people can hear me. I'm hoping that that's the case. Please, if you can hear me, if you can just type in a message there to let me know that that is in fact the case. Obviously we're having a couple of technical issues. Okay. Okay, sorry, no audio. Yep, okay. All right, I'm doing my best. All right, so we're okay in some places and others not. So I think we're just going to have to plow on and just hope that it works wherever you are. My apologies again. All right, so moving right along, if we can now move to a couple of other important bits of information regarding feedback that might be important to you. Let's look at some other research. Now, of course, I want to make this a very practical exercise, but let me say this, that roughly 3 to 1 on a ratio of 3 to 1, employees believe that constructive feedback does more to improve performance than positive feedback. Now, the point of that exercise is that if you're just giving positive feedback just for the sake of it, that's not actually necessarily effective. So what people actually want is constructive feedback. That is, they want you to give them authentic feedback. So if they're not doing it right, they want to know. If they are doing it right, they want to know as well. So it's really important to get that clear, that this is not just all about telling people that they're doing a wonderful job. It's a lot more than that, and that becomes critically important. So the secrets to having an employee listen to your feedback is interestingly, not about your technique. It's very much about whether they respect you, which brings up a whole interesting dimension. So you can have the best feedback technique going and people still won't accept your feedback. And that's an issue of respect rather than technique. So obviously a baseline issue here is to have the capacity to be respected by your colleagues. If in fact they do respect you, then you've got a good platform to work from. So obviously respect is earned, and it's incredibly hard to get, and it requires a degree of authenticity. So, you know, all of these things are predicated on respect. So you can have the best technique in the world, but if you're not respected, it can be an issue. So what that basically means is that if there are two people who are giving exactly the same feedback, it may well be that it has two completely different outcomes based on the employee's perception of respect of that particular leader. So obviously, you know, we all need to work hard at being consistent and persistent, being authentic, being genuine, and so forth. If we work at those kinds of attributes, then we're a long way ahead. So I just want to make that very clear from the start, because if we just simply think that it's all about technique, then we're sadly mistaken. It is a lot more than technique as such. All right, so that's a little bit of information around the issue of respect. Now, as many of you would be aware, a lot of my work is around performance, and particularly around performance reviews, or more specifically, should I say, not performance reviews. I'm not a great fan of performance reviews, and I think one of my reasons for that when it relates to feedback is that some leaders or managers often say that we will not, I'll store up and save up all my feedback for performance review time. So what happens is that during the whole year or 6 months, nobody gets any feedback, and then all of a sudden, bang, they're hit right between the eyes with all of this feedback. So that's one of the reasons I'm against performance reviews, because I just don't believe that it actually helps the ongoing regular dialogue between the leader and the particular team member. But have a look at some of these statistics, which I think are always very interesting. 30% of performance reviews end up decreasing employee performance. In actual fact, there is no research anywhere that I've come across that demonstrates that performance reviews actually increase performance. No definitive empirical evidence of that. 58% of executives believe their current program doesn't result in performance or engagement. So a lot of managers, the ones that are actually implementing the review process, don't believe in the process that they're actually using. Now, obviously, if that's the case, then it's not likely to be a very effective process, just by virtue of the fact that more than half don't believe in it. 70% of companies are now reconsidering their performance strategies. That's probably not surprising to most of you. You've obviously seen Deloitte's removing their performance reviews. A number of other companies, GE and so forth, are actually getting rid of appraisals and ratings as such. 2 out of 3 employees with highest performance scores aren't actually the highest performers. So the problem with ratings, of course, is we assume that a number is very objective, but it's not. It's based on a subjective observation. So when we give someone a 3 out of 5, it doesn't necessarily mean they're a 3 out of 5. It simply means that we perceive them to be a 3 out of 5. So, and often what happens is people hide behind the ratings. So they don't actually explain the rationale for the rating, and that can be a real problem. 6% of companies surveyed think performance reviews are worth it, are worth the time. Well, that's a bit of a negative indictment on performance reviews. 2% of HR executives say yearly evaluations are useful. And again, it's a bit of an issue. or big issue actually, 80% of workers are dissatisfied with performance reviews. So obviously if they're dissatisfied with performance reviews, then the performance review process isn't going to be effective. And 3%, perhaps 3% improvement in performance of all managers believed to be generated in the process. So there's a dim view about performance reviews out there in the world of work. And this particular module, the first one that we're actually covering, is not going to get into performance reviews. In fact, this is about ongoing, regular, constructive feedback that occurs day to day, moment by moment, situation by situation, project by project, person by person, happens everywhere and anywhere about anything that goes on in the workplace. So, in fact, if those sorts of things are going on, the performance review, in my view at least, becomes redundant. So, performance reviews. I've just got a question here that I'll respond to while we've got the opportunity to do that. The question is asking. The question now is asking if we are giving regular feedback, does it mean that we can do away with the performance review? Look, it depends on the culture of your organisation. It really depends on how you operate. But I do believe, and I think it's implicit in your question. Thanks very much for that, Jenny. I do believe that if you're giving people regular feedback, then the performance review should be a pretty easy process because it's not requiring you to give too much feedback, and it's really kind of giving a summary of all the feedback you've probably given over the course of a year. So yes, but that's a decision that your organisation has to make. Okay. Now, one of the things that I think is quite critical in all of this is that we have to be very clear about the expectations that we have for the people that we lead. So what I want to do here is share with you some really, really important questions that you need to ask yourself. So this is questions that you ask yourself. It's not about the employee, although some of them will relate to that. But they're really questions around what are you doing about such and such. The most fundamental question that you need to ask yourself, and you need to look in the mirror and ask, what are your expectations as a leader? Are you crystal clear about what you're expecting in the workplace? I suspect that most of you are, but I think that some of you need to do some hard thinking around what do I actually expect? What's the minimum acceptable standard of performance that I will tolerate across a range of different areas? And I want you to think about this not just from a functional point of view, that is people completing processes and so forth. I want you to think about it in terms of people's standards and behaviours as well. So what do you tolerate in meetings? What's acceptable performance when it comes to teamwork and those sorts of things? Do you actually know what you expect of other people? Because obviously, if you don't, then there's no way in the world that the employee is going to know. Then the next question you need to ask yourself is the question around how I communicate those. Have I communicated those expectations to my team? I think that a lot of us assume that we've done a lot of work communicating expectations, but I don't think we have. This is something that needs to be done regularly and consistently. Persistent and consistent is the mantra. So you need to do this on a regular and consistent basis. People need to be clear. I should be able to walk up to any of your team members and say, tell me what Fred's expectations of you are doing this particular task. And they should be able to tell me immediately what your expectations are. Now, if you've got those two questions answered, you're a long way ahead. But then the next thing is, do they actually understand your expectations? Not only have you communicated it, do they actually understand what it is that you're requiring? Slightly different question. So there needs to be some degree of understanding about what's important there. So, again, what you're trying to do here is get feedback from people about what that might look like. Another question that you need to consider is, do my team members accept my expectations? It's all very well you communicating it. It's all very well them understanding it. But a really important question is, do they accept it? They might think the crossbar is too high, or it's unacceptable, or you're not really serious about that. So there's a bit of work to do, because if you don't have the buy-in of your team members around your expectations, the reality is they're not going to meet those expectations. And it's going to mean that either you're not going to give feedback because it's basically all going to be negative, or if you do, it's probably going to fall on deaf ears. So it's really important to make sure that people accept your expectations. How do you do that? Ask them. Just say, is it clear what I'm asking? The answer should be yes. And say, okay, can I get your agreement on that? And and you want a yes out of that as well. Are your team members committed to that should be committed. Are your team members committed to meeting those expectations? So once again, it's accepting them, but now it's committing to do them. So commitment in this case means consistency. Every single time I complete this process, do this task, complete this project, am I committed to meeting those expectations? And do they know how they are performing against those expectations, which of course is the nature of feedback. So that last question becomes the basis of feedback. So I'd like you to think about those questions, because if you can't confidently answer those questions, then it's highly likely that your feedback process is going to be somewhat less effective than it should be. Okay, moving right along. Oh, and look, the one question, sorry, that it has been or should have been included or is included is, am I supporting my team members to achieve those expectations? Now, I don't necessarily mean holding people's hands. I simply mean giving them the resources, giving them the encouragement, making sure there are not things in the way as distractions, such as conflicting priorities. Do they have an opportunity to actually achieve those expectations via your support? Really important. Sometimes we managers and leaders will give people tasks to do, and quite frankly they're extremely challenging, because maybe there's 10 things on their plate that they've got to complete in a due time frame. Maybe they aren't completely clear about what's expected. Maybe there are other people in the organisation who are not going to support them in that endeavour. There are lots of things there that managers can do something about, or not, but they at least must be able to answer that question. Now, what I want to do now is talk about some of the principles of feedback that are critically important. I'm not going to give you a huge list, but I'm going to give you about 5 things that I believe are critically important when you're actually giving feedback. And I'd like to do that and get you to consider some of these things. Okay, so timing is, and these aren't necessarily in any order, but just keep them in mind when you're giving feedback. Timing is pretty important. In fact, it's very important. And what I mean by timing is, the sooner you can give feedback on an incident, and usually it's an incident that you're giving feedback about, the sooner you can give feedback on that incident, the better, the more effective it will be. That is the feedback. Why? Well, if you give feedback, positive or negative, immediately after a particular event or situation, then the person receiving that feedback realizes how critically important what you're giving them as feedback is. In other words, you've seen it as a priority to actually down tools and actually give that person feedback. Now that's important. Just imagine this. If I noticed that somebody made a really good contribution in a meeting yesterday and I left it for a week and then I saw them in the corridor and I said to them, oh, by the way, incidentally, that initiative that you brought to the meeting last week, that was great, which of course is positive, strength-based feedback. What might the employee think? Well, what they're going to think, of course, is if it was really that wonderful, you would have probably have told me that earlier. In other words, why have you taken so long to tell me? Equally, if you pull someone up in the corridor and said, look, I noticed in that meeting a couple of weeks ago you were quite negative, which is, of course, negative feedback, the person's probably thinking, well, that couldn't be all that important, because if it was, he or she would have mentioned that long ago after the meeting. So just be aware that feedback becomes really important in terms of timing. Now, the practicalities of it are that sometimes you're right in the middle of something and you frankly cannot give people feedback immediately. That's practical. We all understand that that's the case. But the principle of timing says do it as quickly as you possibly can. In other words, find the first available opportunity to give people that feedback, and that bumps up the list of priorities how important that feedback is. So, okay, a week after, is that adequate? Well, it's better than no feedback, of course, but it would have been much more effective after the meeting, if that makes sense. So it's really important to find the opportunity to give timely feedback. Very important. Okay. Now, another mistake that a lot of us make when we're giving feedback, and I've been guilty of this, and I think we all have to a certain extent, and a lot of it's the time constraints that we have, and often we don't think this through, but make sure that your feedback is very specific. So in other words, the best way to give specific feedback is to actually use a critical incident, to actually use an example, because if you use an example, the person can relate to the example. So, for example, if I said to somebody, I'm not at all happy with your really poor attitude, that's not going to go over very well, and you're going to find that that's probably going to be received in a negative way. And it might seem to you that that person's attitude is always negative, but it's obviously you're generalizing, and what you need to do is to say something to the effect of, in the meeting that we just had, I noticed that there were 3 occasions where you interrupted somebody and you basically were negative about their suggestion before you heard it out. And that to me is a problem. See, that's much better feedback because they can relate to what I mean by a negative attitude. So think carefully before you sit down with someone or bump into somebody how you can couch your feedback in very specific terms. Talk about a critical incident or 2 is much, much better. So being specific is critically important. Now, a couple of things I want to talk about that, and I want to give you a couple of examples about being specific that I think are really very relevant. As I said, make your feedback specific. But look, if you said to somebody this, overall, good job on the presentation at this morning's meeting. So obviously, at least it's immediate, or as immediate as perhaps it can be, but it could have been better. So that's your feedback. So at least you're giving feedback. At least it's reasonably immediate because obviously it happened this morning. But the person's obviously thinking, well, that's a bit vague. Unless they ask you, they might well be blindsided by that and say nothing and walk away shaking their head wondering what it is that they could have done better. So it's a bit vague. They're wondering I wonder what he or she thought was wrong with it. They didn't seem to tell me anything. I wonder what they meant by that. And plus because you didn't like it, it doesn't necessarily mean it was bad. So how could it have been better? That's the key thing. You haven't mentioned how it could be better. They don't even know what it was that wasn't effective. So you started off by saying it was great, and then you've ended up saying, well, it could have been better. That's all they remember, that last bit, of course. So you might as well not have even mentioned the fact that they gave a good presentation this morning. Here's a better way. How about you say something like this? Great job on the presentation. I really liked how you used statistics to back up your key points. You'll notice I'm being very specific there. And then you might say, one small comment. Maybe for next time, it could be for you to invite more comments from the group to get them more involved in your presentation. All right, so that's my feedback. In other words, I think you should have people more involved. I would imagine that the second lot of feedback will go over a lot better. More importantly, it is likely that the person will take on board that feedback. And it's more than likely that that person will start asking a few more questions at the next meeting when they have to give a presentation. They are likely to get people involved in the presentation. So that's what I mean by specific. I hope that that's pretty clear. Now, the other thing about feedback that I think is critically important is frequency. In other words, it's really important to have regular feedback. These feedback sessions are not one-off events. So please think about it as a sequence of interactions with people. And I think the very best way to do this, and I've found it works extremely well, is to say to somebody at the end of giving them feedback, particularly if it's important, obviously, if it's, it's something that you really want to monitor, say to the other person, look, let's leave it for a couple of weeks, and I'd like to get together with you again in a couple of weeks and just see how we're going in terms of progress. So what you've actually done is you've opened the door for another meeting. So the other person's actually expecting you then to actually approach them to ask and talk about feedback. So you've opened the door for the possibility of another opportunity to give feedback. And really at that next meeting, when you tap them on the shoulder and you can say, I promise that we'd get back together again and have a bit of a chat about such and such, the other person doesn't feel as if you're micromanaging them, and they also feel that you are keeping your promises because you've already promised to do that. And there's only three possibilities out of the second meeting, which is the follow-up meeting. Either the feedback has, the performance has improved, the performance has gone backwards, or the performance has remained the same. And what I suggest you do in that follow-up meeting is ask them how they think things have been tracking. So ask them to say, how do you think things have been going since the last time we spoke? And and listen carefully to what they say. And if you disagree, then by all means disagree. All right, just say, look, I have a different view about that. Be prepared to back it up again, as I say, with a critical incident and explain what it is. But of course, if you agree, then you can say, I agree with you. I agree, I agree that you've made progress and I really appreciate that. And then you let it go for a little while until you meet again. So really what you should be looking at is a sequence of meetings over a period of time. And if you do it that way, you'll get much, much better results. And you'll find that you'll feel more confident, the particular team member will feel more confident about you, and it's just a good way to operate. Now, a lot of people think that feedback is around, saying or having very slick phrases or having, nice sounding words, and it's all about being clever with words. Nothing further could be from the truth. Yes, you do need to couch things in tactful ways, and yes, you do need to think carefully about backing up your assertions, specifically with incidents. Absolutely, no doubt about that. But your job is to actually get the other person to do as much work in the conversation as you are putting in. So an ideal feedback session would be you doing 50% of the talking or less, and the other person doing 50% of the talking or more. Now, if you can get to a situation like that, then you have that person completely empowered in the feedback. So how do you do that? Well, the obvious tool is to ask questions. So, for example, if you're giving people a bit of feedback like we saw on the previous screen, you might then say to the other person, what do you think about that feedback? You just throw it out there. You want them to talk. You want them to make a comment. You want them to make an observation. And then it's really important for you not to interrupt them while they're giving some sort of feedback about the feedback. So ask open-ended questions. And remember, open-ended questions are why, what, where, who, how, and which. All of those questions will elicit more than a one-word answer. Why did you say that? What did you mean by that comment? When did it take place? How did it occur? Exactly, and that draws the other person into a conversation. So be prepared to involve and engage the other person in the conversation. I can assure you if you do that, you'll be much better off. The other thing about feedback I think is critically important is to try to do it in privacy. Now a lot of people say, oh, you should be praising people in public. Some people are hugely embarrassed by being praised in front of other people. I just don't think it's worth taking the risk, frankly. I think what you do is you pull the person aside and you actually give them positive feedback to their face, making good eye contact with them, or if it's negative feedback, you do exactly the same. And you do it in privacy. And I think that's really important. And I know a lot of you work in open office environments, and it's particularly hard to do that. So it might be that you actually have to go to the trouble of booking a meeting room to give this feedback. But if that's the case, then do so. It's really important that you do that in private because you can embarrass someone. You can embarrass yourself too if the whole feedback session doesn't go well, which is another good reason to actually do it in privacy, in private. So it's very important to do it in private, I believe. And as I've mentioned before, you need to use critical incidents. And what I'm suggesting there is that you really need to find opportunities where you can explain to the other person the positive or the negative behaviour that you're giving feedback about. So, and look, that shouldn't be difficult because let's face it, most feedback will eventuate from a situation that's occurred. So you use the situation as a critical incident to give that feedback. It also prevents you from generalising because generalisations are not good. So, to say to someone, your reports are always inaccurate is, whilst in your head it might seem like it's truth, it's actually not going to go over very well. But if you said the last 3 reports that I've received from you had too many mistakes in it, is a much more effective, specific, feedback that's based on 3 critical incidents in this case. So that becomes really important. Now, the other thing about feedback is that really, why would we even bother? What's the point of giving feedback? Well, the whole point of giving feedback, of course, is to focus on the future. What we're trying to do, of course, is to either reinforce the positive behaviour or to negate the negative behaviour. So we're really actually talking about the future. So it's all about how we're going to actually modify or continue behaviour for the future. So get the focus very much on what's going to happen next. And I think that's a great way of actually putting it to people, is to actually say, what do you intend to do differently next time? Questions like that are great. Or how are you going to take this feedback on board in the future? Just use your own words, but what you're trying to do is to get the team member to come to a realisation about what they'll do and make a commitment to that in the future. Or, you demonstrated a really good level of engagement in that meeting we just had, and I think that was great. What did you learn from that, and what will you do to continue that in the future? So those are the sort of questions that really get people focused in the future. The other thing is there's no point in talking about the past, and the only reason that you should be talking about the past is to draw attention to a behaviour that you want improved or that you want to continue. And then once that's been discussed, you then move the conversation to what will happen in the future. That's really important. So what I'd like to do now is that most people, if you look at the books in the bookstores and so forth, most of the books out there are on, conversations on poor performance. And, they aren't easy. So I thought what I could do here is give you a couple of tips that might assist you. So you've probably got law of averages, one person in your team at least who's just not performing. And you might be, you might have tried something with them and it hasn't worked, or maybe you don't want to open a can of worms and you've decided not to talk to them. Well, let me give you a couple of tips that might be helpful here, that might assist you in future, because look, at the end of the day, let me make it very clear, it won't go away. You need to get that very clear. Often we hope that the person will get it. It won't. Okay, so it won't go away. So let's have a look at some of the things that you can do immediately. One of the things that you can do immediately is get straight to the point. So obviously, if you're going to talk about poor performance, there's no room for chit-chat. There's no room for courtesies. You can still be friendly and firm, but if let's say you've booked a room and you've decided to sit down with the person to talk about one aspect of their performance that's not going well, they're sitting there thinking, what's this all about? Let's get it over with. When are they going to explain to me what I'm here for if they don't know? So blurt it straight out. Get straight to the point, because it's not a conversation at the lunchroom. It's a performance conversation. So think carefully about the words that you're going to use. That's really important. So in fact, I often say to people when I'm coaching them, write down the sentence that you will use to broach the subject that you need to talk to them about. So if you get the first sentence right, then you'll find that your whole conversation will go much, much better. And keep those principles in mind that I mentioned. Okay, explain the purpose of the meeting. That's the first thing that should come out of your mouth. Look, the reason I've asked you to come here is that I wanted to talk to you about an incident that occurred yesterday with customer X. All right, so the other person is absolutely crystal clear about what it is that we are sitting down and discussing. So then, of course, the next step is to explain to them, either the positive or the negatives of that exchange that you observed with the customer. Another really important principle is once you've given the feedback, which remember has those principles, is then to keep quiet and ask the person for their point of view. The sooner you can get the other person talking in these difficult conversations, the better. How do you do that? Ask them a question. Just say, do you remember that incident yesterday? What was your impression of it? And just keep quiet. Just allow the person to talk about it. Some people will need more encouragement to talk about it, and other people, of course, won't, and that becomes an issue. You might have to encourage people to talk more, and other people you just need to listen a little bit longer than perhaps you would like to. That's just human nature. The important point out of all of that is to bite your tongue until it bleeds. In other words, please don't interrupt the person. That's critically important, because if you interrupt the person, what you're actually doing is you are being discourteous, and I know there'll be things that are said that are inaccurate. They're not based on fact, but just hear them out, and then when they're finished, you can correct them. So in other words, at the end of it, you can say, look, there were just a couple of things that you said there that I'd like to address, and then you can do that after they've finished. A couple of other things. It's not an argument, so don't get into an argument. In fact, you can actually use the old phrase, let's agree to disagree, or I refuse to argue with you about this, is good enough. It's not an argument. It shouldn't be an argument. It's about performance improvement. So it's not about an argument. Try and focus on the performance. Do not get sidetracked into other issues around personality and other things. And sometimes people will try and take you off the track. Why do they do that? Because it will take the responsibility away from the performance. Focus on the future, and basically, as I said before, the whole emphasis is to try to remedy the performance for the future. So talk about what will happen in future. So if you're using this customer this incident as an example, you might then ask, what could you do differently next time if you were faced with a similar circumstance? Emphasise the strengths as well as the weaknesses, and look, if there were some positive things that came out of the incident, or you notice some, look, at the very minimum, one of the things you can say to the person is, I've got every confidence that you can apply what we've talked about today. Because what would be the point of you having this performance conversation if you didn't think that they could improve? So of course, give them the encouragement that you are sure that they can do it better next time. And finally, I think it's very important to seek out the causes. Now, this isn't sequential, of course. You need to ask why. We call this the why approach. Why did that occur? Why did that occur? Why did that occur? You're drilling down further and further into the issue so that the other person is giving you more specific and accurate causes for why that performance wasn't the way it was. Say somebody's late to work, and you say, why were you late to work? And they say, oh, well, I just had a few hassles on the way to work. And you just accept that. And you say, well, what are they? Or what are those hassles? And they say, well, look, I got caught up in the traffic. And you might say, well, why was that a problem today? It's not normally a problem for you. And they say, well, I must admit I left a bit late and I got caught up in peak hour. So by doing that, you're getting down to the real causes, and of course you can address the cause then. Okay, this pretty much brings us to the end of today's module. I've got a little bit of homework for you, and I want you to try this afternoon, if there is an afternoon, and if there's not, do this tomorrow. I want you to go out and make a commitment to give feedback 3 times every day for the next week, and I want you to actually make a conscious effort to do this. So how do you do it? How do you remind yourself in your busy schedules? We're all busy. We all get caught up in all sorts of things, meetings and emails and what have you. What I would ask you to do is to, write it down, put a little visual on your desk, put a wristband on. I don't care how you do it. Just remind yourself that you need to give more feedback, and you need to give 3 bits of feedback. Those bits of feedback can be positive or negative. It doesn't matter. I just want you to get into the habit and get used to giving feedback. And just be courageous, look for the opportunities, and go out and do it. They don't have to be long-winded meetings. It could be feedback in the corridor. It could be, it could be 2-minute conversation. It could be a half-an-hour conversation if it's really serious. It doesn't matter. I'm not interested in how long it takes. I'm interested in whether you do it. Now, after 1 week, that means that you will have given 15 minutes of feedback during that week. I can tell you something. I'll tell you something that's interesting about that. You will feel better about yourself at the end of the week. Why? Because you're doing what you know you should be doing. And some of those statistics I showed you earlier, the employee themselves will feel better as well. Why? Because you are doing what they know you should be doing, which is essentially about giving feedback. But please don't get confused. If somebody doesn't like the feedback, that doesn't mean that they don't need it. It just means that they don't like it. And the important thing for you is to realise that it's still important to give that feedback. I mean, if you're near a window at the moment, look outside, or just look at all the rules and regulations. Look at all the laws that we have. Look at all the look throughout our societies. Human beings fundamentally need to know where they stand. Human beings need to know what the expectations of them are. It doesn't always mean that they'll stick to them, but it basically means that we need to know. And what that means is they need to also know whether they're meeting those expectations. And your job, of course, is to do that using what I mentioned before, which was critical incidents. We've got a question here in relation to feedback, and I'm just going to address that. We've still got a few minutes before we finish up in this first module. The question asks, what about people who aren't willing to open up during a feedback session? How do we get them to talk? That's a good question. I've had people as well that I've led who are very introvert, who just kind of won't say much at all, and I end up doing most of the talking. It's really, really important, and this is what I suggest you do, is to ask them an open-ended question, maintain steady eye contact with them, not glaring, just steady eye contact. Obviously, if it's on the phone, that's a bit more difficult, but maintain steady eye contact with them. And then, after you've asked the question, bite your tongue until it bleeds. In other words, don't say a word. Because if you fill that space, then the reality is they're off the hook. So in other words, you ask the question and pause. Now sometimes that pause might seem like an eternity, but I can assure you, if you're willing to do that, they will eventually say something. And when they do, you just can ask a supplementary question such as, can you explain that to me a little more, please, so I understand? Or what did you mean by that? Or can you give me an example that will help me to understand what you mean? So it takes a bit of work. It is hard work, but the good news is you just have to ask the question, hold your nerve, don't say anything, and you will find that the other person will ultimately answer the question. But what a lot of us do, of course, is we get very fearful of that silence, and what we do is we answer our own question for us, for us both, or we make a statement or something, and then basically the other person doesn't have to respond, and we end up just doing all the talking, which is problematic because we want them to be doing a lot of the talking. Now, of course, the person asking me that question didn't ask this question, but what about the people you can't shut up? How do you shut them up? Well, the way to do that is that the moment they draw breath, and you've got to be right on the button about this because some of them can do this very quickly, as soon as they draw breath, you jump in and you summarise what they've said. So you actually say, so in other words, you didn't get the right information from the person in the other team, and that meant that you made a mistake. Now they've spent, let's say, 10 minutes telling you that. what I've done is I've summarised in one quick sentence what it is that they've been trying to tell me. I've now got control of the conversation. I can now move on and talk about what we're going to do about it. So that's one of the responses that you can use when you want to keep people quiet, because obviously you don't want the other person doing all the talking. That's why I say a 50-50 is probably not a bad way to go. Guys, there's probably a few other questions, and this series, you can send them to me via email, or if you just type them in anyway, I'm going to get to them eventually. So there's always, and remember, we've got a lot of people online, so it's quite possible that I'm not going to get around and answer all your questions, but I will eventually. So if I don't now, I will between sessions. All right, I just wanted to say something about the series before we wrap up that I think is very important. The first thing that's very important is please enroll in all the sessions, even if you find that you can't make a session. There they all are there. Please enroll. Why? Because if you enroll, you will receive a copy of the slides, and you will also receive a copy of the recording. So I've recorded this, and I mean, this is obviously going to be handy now because we had a few audio problems at the beginning of the first session, so you can go back and have a listen to that. So you will get a copy of the recording, and you'll get a copy also of the slides if you can't make the session. But please, the idea is, of course, to make a commitment and discipline yourself to be at each of these sessions. We've obviously tried to make it as easy as possible over lunch, or for lots of people it is lunch. So please enroll. You just have to put your name in, and you just have to put your email address in. I know it seems a bit silly to do it for each one. Why can't you just do it for one? Just go through, because each of them are separate broadcasts. So just put that in, would be very helpful. Please do your homework. It's really important you do that. The whole purpose of that, of course, is for you to get some runs on the board in between sessions. You'll notice that next time we meet on the 31st of August, we're talking about influencing skills, and I'm going to ask you to do a diagnostic before that, and you'll find that quite interesting. So in other words, I want you to come along to that broadcast having completed a diagnostic, and my hour over lunch at that time will actually be around a debrief on that. We'll talk about team performance in Module 3. We'll talk about some motivational theories in Module 4, how to get the best out of people. For number 5, we'll talk about personality profiles and how best to relate to the different motivations and personalities that are out there. And again, I will probably get you to do a diagnostic for Module 5. And number 6, we spend our life in meetings, and you could argue this is a meeting. You go to another meeting straight after this. The idea is that you need to become good at running meetings. I don't think there's any excuse for a leader not to be good at running meetings. It's a core skill, in my view, for a leader. So we'll talk about some of the very practical things that you can do to become more effective as a team leader, as a leader, a facilitator of team meetings. All right, so folks, thank you very much. I've enjoyed working with you today. I apologise about some of the audio problems early on. That's one of the problems, isn't it, with technology? But at least if you did miss some of that early stage, you'll get an audio, or you'll get a recording that might help you. So I look forward to seeing you on the 31st. What I'd ask you to do now is to, if you haven't already, have lunch. If you have, then go out and give 3 bits of feedback, and so by the weekend you've started. So have a great weekend, and we'll catch up with you on the 31st of August. Thank you very much.